The silence in my house had a physical weight to it. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was a presence, a thick, dusty blanket that smothered everything. I'd inherited the place from my grandmother, a sprawling old farmhouse that was far too big for one person. It sat on a few acres of overgrown land, a lonely island in a sea of green. For 2 years, I had lived with the silence, with the ghosts of family dinners and the echoes of laughter that weren't my own. I worked from home, an illustrator of children's books, which meant my world was often confined to the 4 walls of my studio and the vibrant, imaginary lives I put on paper. My own life felt pale in comparison, a watercolor sketch left out in the rain. The French doors in the living room were the final straw. They led out to a stone patio that was slowly being reclaimed by moss and weeds. One of the hinges had rusted through, causing the right door to sag drunkenly, refusing to close. For months, I'd wedged a book under it, a temporary fix that had become depressingly permanent. The gap let in drafts, autumn leaves, and a constant, tangible reminder of my own inertia. It was a broken thing in a broken house inhabited by a man who felt just as misaligned. I couldn't fix it myself. My skills lay in brushstrokes and ink, not in wood planes and levels. Admitting that felt like a different kind of failure. I found his number on a corkboard at the local feed store, tacked next to ads for lost cats and homemade jam. Cole Miller, carpentry and general repairs. No job too small. Honest work. The card was simple, black text on plain white stock, no fancy logos. It felt solid, reliable. I carried it in my pocket for a week before I finally got the courage to call. His voice on the phone was exactly what I didn't expect. It wasn't the gruff bark of a seasoned handyman. It was low and calm, a smooth baritone that seemed to vibrate right through the receiver. It made me sit up straighter. We set a time. He'd come by the next afternoon to take a look. I spent the next 24 hours in a state of low-grade panic, cleaning surfaces that hadn't been touched in years and feeling absurdly self-conscious about the state of my home, and by extension, my life. He arrived precisely at 2 o'clock. A dusty, dark blue Ford pickup crunched to a stop on the gravel driveway. I watched from the window as he got out. He was tall, broader than I'd imagined, with dark hair cut short and the kind of easy, deliberate movements that spoke of physical confidence. He wore a plain gray t-shirt that stretched across his shoulders, faded jeans, and work boots caked with dry mud. He wasn't handsome in a polished, magazine sort of way. His features were solid, his jaw firm, his presence grounded and utterly real. He filled the space his body occupied, and then some. I opened the front door before he could knock, trying to seem casual, like I hadn't been watching his every move. "Cole." He turned, and his eyes met mine. They were a clear, startling hazel, flecked with green and gold. They took me in for a moment, a quick, efficient assessment. "Leo? Good to meet you," he offered a hand. His grip was firm, his palm calloused and warm. The handshake was brief, professional, yet a strange jolt went up my arm. It was the first time I'd touched another person in weeks. "You too. Thanks for coming out. The problem's in here." I led him through the quiet house to the living room. He walked with a quiet economy of motion, his boots making soft, solid sounds on the old hardwood floors. The scent of sawdust, fresh air, and something clean like pine soap followed him, temporarily displacing the house's usual smell of dust and old paper. He stopped in front of the sagging French doors and just looked, his head tilted slightly. He didn't say anything for a full minute, just observed. I found myself holding my breath, waiting for a verdict. "Hinge is shot," he said finally, his voice that same low rumble from the phone. "Looks like the frame's warped a bit, too. Water damage, probably." He ran a hand along the wood, his fingers tracing the rod I'd been trying to ignore. His hands were large and capable, the nails clean but the knuckles scarred with the small nicks and cuts of his trade. I watched those hands, fascinated by their competence. "Can it be fixed?" I asked, my voice sounding thin in the heavy silence. "Everything can be fixed," he said, and the corner of his mouth ticked up in a faint smile. He looked at me then, and that hazel gaze was direct, unwavering. My stomach did a slow, nervous flip. He turned back to the door and pulled a metal tape measure from a loop on his jeans. "I'll need to get the dimensions for a new jam. It'll be a custom job." He knelt, hooking the end of the tape to the bottom of the frame. He stood, extending the metal ribbon upward. "Can you hold this end for me?" he asked, gesturing to the top corner. I stepped forward, my fingers clumsy as I pressed the end of the tape against the wood. We were standing close now, close enough for me to feel a faint warmth radiating from his body, to see the way his dark eyelashes curled at the tips. He needed to measure the width, from my side of the frame to the other. He stretched the tape across the opening. All right, now I need you to be the other end of this measurement. Just stand right there. He pointed to a spot on the floor. I moved to it, feeling like a clumsy piece of furniture. He walked toward me, the tape measure reeling out between us. He stopped just in front of me, our chests only a foot apart. He looked down at the tape, then at my waist. My heart began a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. What is he doing? Hold still, he said, his voice quiet. And then he did it. He reached out, not to my arm or my shoulder, but lower. His fingers were warm as he hooked his thumb into the empty belt loop at the side of my jeans. It was a simple, practical gesture. He needed an anchor point, a steady spot to pull the tape measure taut against. For him, I was just a post, a convenient object. But for me, the world tilted on its axis. The rough denim, the slight pressure of his thumb against my hip bone, the casual, unthinking intimacy of the touch. It sent a shockwave through my entire system. My breath hitched. I could feel the heat of his touch through the fabric, a small, searing point of contact that my entire consciousness zeroed in on. I am standing perfectly still. My body is a statue, but inside, everything is chaos. My blood is rushing in my ears, a frantic tidal wave. His thumb is hooked in my belt loop. Just his thumb. It's a purely functional gesture. He is a contractor. I am a client. This is a measurement. But my body doesn't know the difference between function and feeling. It only registers the warmth, the proximity, the solid presence of him, so close I can smell the faint, clean scent of his skin beneath the wood and soap. I stare straight ahead at the peeling paint on the opposite wall, praying he can't hear the frantic drumming of my heart. He pulls the tape taut, the metal edge pressing lightly against my shirt. He leans in to read the measurement, and for a split second, his temple brushes against mine. The contact is electric, a spark on dry tinder. His hair is soft. He smells like the outdoors, like honest work. He smells real. He made a small sound of satisfaction, a low hum in his chest, and released the tape. It snapped back into its case with a loud whir. He let go of my belt loop. The absence of his touch was as jarring as its presence had been. A cold spot lingered where his thumb had been. He stepped back, all business again, scribbling a number onto a small notepad he'd pulled from his back pocket. He didn't seem to notice that I was rooted to the spot, my entire nervous system still screaming. All right, he said, flipping the notepad shut. I can do it. I'll have to order the wood. Might take a few days to get here. I can start the prep work tomorrow, though. Tearing out the old frame. I finally found my voice, forcing it to sound normal. Okay, yeah, that sounds good. He looked at me again, his expression unreadable. That steady gaze felt like it could see right through my carefully constructed walls, right into the lonely, fluttering mess inside. You okay? You look a little pale. Fine. I managed, the word coming out a little too fast. Just haven't had enough coffee today. It was a weak lie, and we both knew it. A small, almost imperceptible smile played on his lips again. It wasn't mocking. It was knowing. Or maybe I was just projecting my own internal chaos onto him. I'll be here around 8 tomorrow morning, if that works for you, he said, tucking the notepad away. 8 is perfect, I said. He gave a short nod, and then he was walking away, his solid presence receding down the hallway. I followed him to the door, my legs feeling unsteady. He stepped out onto the porch and turned back. See you tomorrow, Leo. See you tomorrow, Cole. I watched him walk to his truck, get in, and drive away, leaving a small cloud of dust hanging in the afternoon air. I closed the door and leaned my forehead against the cool wood, my eyes squeezed shut. The silence of the house rushed back in, but this time it was different. It was charged, humming with the memory of his presence, with the phantom feeling of a thumb hooked in my belt loop. One simple touch, a gesture that meant nothing, had just cracked the foundation of my quiet, solitary world. And I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that nothing was going to be the same. The next morning, I was up at 6, a full hour before my alarm. I made coffee, but my hands were shaking so badly I spilled the grounds all over the counter. I felt like a teenager preparing for a first date, a ridiculous notion for a 32-year-old man. He was a contractor. He was here to fix a door. He was, by all available evidence, a straight man doing his job. My reaction to him was my own problem, a product of my profound and chronic loneliness. I repeated this to myself like a mantra as I cleaned the kitchen with frantic energy. His truck pulled in at 7:58. The punctuality was both reassuring and intimidating. I opened the door to find him standing on the porch, a heavy-duty tool bag in one hand and a travel mug of coffee in the other. He was wearing a dark green Henley today, the sleeves pushed up to his elbows, revealing strong, lightly tanned forearms dusted with dark hair. "Morning," he said, his voice a low gravel that seemed to settle the frantic energy in my chest. "Morning. Coffee?" I asked, gesturing with my own mug. He lifted his. "Got my own. Thanks." He gave me that small, almost smile. But I wouldn't say no to a refill later. The possibility of a later hung in the air between us. I stepped aside to let him in, and the house was once again filled with his solid presence and that scent of pine and clean sweat. He set his bag down in the living room with a heavy thud, the sound of purpose echoing in the quiet space. For the next hour, I pretended to work in my studio, but it was a farce. My window overlooked the patio, giving me a perfect, unobstructed view of him as he began the demolition. I watched him work. There was a raw beauty in his efficiency, a grace in the way he moved. He laid out a heavy canvas drop cloth with a flick of his wrists. He used a pry bar to gently, methodically, remove the trim around the door frame. His movements were never rushed, never wasted. Every action had a clear intent. The muscles in his back and shoulders coiled and released under the fabric of his shirt as he worked. He was completely absorbed, his focus absolute. I found myself sketching his hands on a scrap of paper, the way his fingers wrapped around the handle of a hammer, the tension in his knuckles as he pried at a stubborn piece of wood. Around 10, he stopped and stretched, arching his back and pressing his palms into the base of his spine. He rolled his head on his neck, and his gaze drifted up, catching me watching from the window. I froze, my pencil hovering over the paper, my face burning with the heat of being caught. I expected him to look away, to give a polite nod, to ignore my blatant staring. He didn't. He held my gaze for a long, stretched-out moment. And then he smiled. It wasn't the small, polite quirk of the lips from before. It was a real smile, a slow spreading of warmth that reached his hazel eyes, making them crinkle at the corners. It was devastating. It felt like a secret shared, an acknowledgement of the attention I was paying him. Then he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and turned back to his work, leaving me breathless and flustered in my quiet studio. I abandoned any pretense of working and went downstairs to make a fresh pot of coffee. My hands were steady now, my earlier anxiety replaced by a humming, nervous energy. When the coffee was done, I poured a mug for him, black. I guessed it seemed to fit him, and carried it out to the patio. "Thought you might be ready for that refill," I said, my voice carefully casual. He was kneeling, examining the newly exposed studs of the wall. He looked up, his face smudged with a bit of dust. Perfect timing. "Thanks." He took the mug, his fingers brushing against mine. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent another jolt through me. He took a sip, his eyes closing for a moment in appreciation. "That's good coffee. It's the only thing I know how to make well," I admitted. He chuckled, a low, pleasant sound. "Everyone's got to be good at something." He took another long drink, his gaze fixed on the empty space where the door used to be. We stood in a comfortable silence for a moment, the only sounds the chirping of birds and the distant hum of a lawnmower. "This is a nice piece of land," he said, looking out over the overgrown yard. "Quiet. Too quiet, sometimes," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. It was more honest than I'd intended to be. He looked at me then, his expression thoughtful. He wasn't looking at me like a client anymore. He was looking at me like a person. "I get that," he said softly. "A place this big needs more noise." He gestured with his mug toward the house. "You live here alone?" The question was direct, but his tone was gentle, curious rather than invasive. "Yeah, just me." He nodded slowly, his eyes scanning my face. I felt stripped bare under that gaze, all my loneliness and quiet desperation laid out for his inspection. I braced myself for pity, for the polite but awkward retreat that usually followed such a confession. Instead, he just said, "Well, at least for the next few days, you'll have the sound of a saw to keep you company." He gave me another one of those small, knowing smiles, and the tension in my chest eased. He wasn't judging me. He was, in his own quiet way, connecting. The days fell into a new rhythm. Cole would arrive at 8, and the house would come alive with the sounds of his work. The whine of a circular saw, the rhythmic tap of a hammer, the low murmur of a radio he sometimes played, tuned to a classic rock station. I'd bring him coffee in the morning and we'd talk for a few minutes, our conversations circling around safe topics: the weather, the progress on the door, my work. He asked to see some of my illustrations, and his interest was genuine. He looked at the detailed drawings of whimsical animals and enchanted forests with a quiet intensity, his calloused finger hovering just above the paper, as if afraid to smudge the ink. "You're really good," he said, his voice filled with a surprising reverence. "You create whole worlds on a piece of paper. And you build real things," I countered. "You fix what's broken." He met my eyes over the top of a drawing of a badger in a waistcoat. "Sometimes the worlds on paper feel more real," he said, and the admission was so unexpected, so vulnerable, that it left me speechless. The physical space between us seemed to be shrinking. When he showed me a piece of wood, explaining the grain, he'd stand closer than necessary, his arm brushing mine. When I handed him a tool he'd dropped, his hand would linger on mine for a fraction of a second too long. These were tiny moments, easily deniable, probably insignificant. But my starved senses cataloged every single one. I was an archaeologist of small gestures, dusting them off, examining them for meaning, trying to assemble them into a coherent story. I was driving myself crazy, oscillating between the giddy hope that he felt something, too, and the crushing certainty that I was just a lonely man projecting his fantasies onto a kind, straight contractor. The breakthrough came on the third day. The new door jamb was in, a beautiful piece of solid oak that smelled of fresh-cut wood. Cole had spent the morning sanding it, his movements patient and rhythmic. I had offered to make lunch, a simple affair of sandwiches and iced tea, and to my surprise, he accepted. We sat on the back patio, the newly framed doorway gaping open beside us. "My dad was a carpenter," Cole said, after a long, comfortable silence. He was staring at his own hands, turning them over as if seeing them for the first time. "He could build anything. Taught me everything I know. He always said, 'Measure twice, cut once, and respect the wood.'" "He sounds like a good man," I said. "He was," Cole said, his voice quiet. "He passed away a few years ago." He took a long swallow of his iced tea. "I was working a desk job back then. Sales. Hated every minute of it. Wearing a tie felt like a noose. After he died, I just quit. I took the money he left me, bought a truck and some tools, and started this business. Felt like the only real thing to do." He looked up from his hands and met my gaze. There was a raw honesty in his eyes, a flicker of old pain and a bedrock of quiet conviction. He was sharing a piece of himself with me, something real and important. He was trusting me with his story. "I think that's the bravest thing I've ever heard," I said, and I meant it. A faint blush colored his neck. He looked away, out toward the trees at the edge of the property. "It wasn't brave. It was survival." He turned back to me, his expression serious. "What about you? This house, your family." And so I told him. I told him about my grandmother, about growing up visiting this house, about how it was the only place I ever felt truly safe. I told him about my parents, who lived on the other side of the country and communicated mostly through cheerful, impersonal emails. I told him about the loneliness, not in a self-pitying way, but as a simple statement of fact, like describing the weather. He listened, his entire attention focused on me. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer platitudes. He just listened, his hazel eyes reflecting a deep, quiet empathy. When I finished, the silence that fell between us was different. It wasn't empty. It was full, weighted with the stories we had shared. It was the silence of understanding. "You're not as alone as you think you are, Leo," he said, his voice so low it was almost a whisper. His words hung in the warm afternoon air, and I felt a crack appear in the wall I'd built around my heart. It was a terrifying, exhilarating feeling. He was seeing me, not just the client, not just the quiet illustrator. He was seeing the man underneath, the one I kept hidden from the world. And he wasn't running away. He was leaning in. That afternoon, the sky turned a bruised, heavy gray. The air grew thick and still, charged with the electric promise of a storm. Cole had just finished hanging the new doors, and he was adjusting the hinges, making sure they swung smoothly. I stood nearby, ostensibly to help, but really just to be near him. The atmosphere inside the house mirrored the one outside, tense, quiet, and humming with an unspoken energy. A low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. Cole glanced out the newly installed glass panes. "Looks like we're in for it," he said, his voice calm. "I should probably pack up before it hits." But the storm was faster than he was. The sky opened up with a sudden, violent deluge. Rain hammered against the roof and windows, a deafening roar that swallowed all other sounds. The lights flickered once, twice, and then died, plunging the house into a dim, gray twilight. "Damn," Cole muttered, straightening up. He was a solid silhouette against the pale light of the storm-lashed windows. "Power's out," I stated, the words feeling redundant and foolish. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic counter-rhythm to the pounding rain. We were trapped. The gravel road leading to my house was prone to washing out in heavy downpours. He wasn't going anywhere. "Looks like it," he said. He didn't sound annoyed or concerned, just matter of fact. He moved through the gloom with an easy confidence, pulling his phone from his pocket and switching on its flashlight. The bright beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. "You got candles?" "Flashlights." "In the kitchen," I said, my voice barely a whisper. My mind was racing. He was here. He was staying. The forced proximity I had only dreamed of was now a reality, and it was both terrifying and intoxicating. We found the candles and a box of matches. Soon, the living room was filled with the soft, flickering glow of half a dozen small flames. The lights softened the edges of everything, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. It felt impossibly intimate. We sat on opposite ends of the sofa, the space between us charged with a palpable tension. The roar of the storm outside created a strange, isolated bubble for the two of us inside. "So," I said, just to break the silence, "this is unexpected." Cole was leaning forward, his elbows on his knees, staring into the flame of a candle on the coffee table. The light carved his face into sharp angles and soft shadows, highlighting the strong line of his jaw and the intensity of his gaze. "I don't mind the rain," he said, his voice low and contemplative. "Washes everything clean." He looked over at me, and his eyes in the candlelight were dark, deep pools. "You seem nervous, Leo." It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation, a gentle prodding. He was giving me an opening. My throat was dry. I could lie, make a joke, deflect. But looking at him, at the quiet sincerity in his face, I found I couldn't. "I'm not used to company," I said, the admission costing me more than I wanted it to, especially not when the power's out. He held my gaze, and a long, loaded silence stretched between us. The only sounds were the rain on the roof and the frantic beating of my own heart. He didn't look away. He didn't move. He just watched me, his expression unreadable but intense. It felt like he was waiting for something, giving me the space to say more, to be honest. What am I doing? My mind is screaming. This is Cole, your contractor, a kind man who is just being friendly. Don't ruin this. Don't make it weird. But my heart, my foolish, lonely heart, is whispering a different story. It's whispering about the way he looks at me when he thinks I'm not watching, the way his fingers lingered on mine, the knowing smile that says he sees more than I'm showing. He shifted on the couch, the slight movement pulling me from my thoughts. He moved closer, closing half the distance between us. My breath caught in my throat. He didn't stop until his knee was brushing against mine. The contact was a furnace, sending heat spreading through my entire body. "Leo," he said, and my name on his lips in the dark, quiet room was an intimacy all its own. His voice was a low, rough thing that vibrated through the air between us. I couldn't speak. I could only look at him, my eyes wide, my entire being consumed by a mixture of terror and hope so potent it made me dizzy. He reached out, his hand moving with an agonizing slowness. I thought he was going to touch my arm, my shoulder. A safe, friendly gesture. But his hand came to my face, his calloused, warm fingers gently cupping my jaw. His thumb stroked softly over my cheek, a whisper of a touch that undid me completely. My eyes fluttered shut. "This isn't just about the door, is it?" he murmured, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. It was a question, but it sounded like a statement. A confession. I opened my eyes. His face was so close now. I could see the flecks of gold in his irises, feel the warmth of his breath on my skin. The world had shrunk to this single moment, to the space between his mouth and mine. All the overthinking, all the fear, all the lonely nights, it all melted away, leaving only this raw, terrifying, beautiful truth. "No," I breathed, the word a ghost of a sound. It was never about the door. A slow smile touched his lips, a smile of pure, unadulterated relief. And then he leaned in and closed the final distance between us. His lips were soft, hesitant at first, a question. I answered by leaning into him, my hand coming up to rest on his chest, feeling the solid, steady beat of his heart beneath my palm. The kiss deepened, becoming something sure and certain. It wasn't rushed or frantic. It was a slow, deliberate exploration, a conversation without words that spoke of weeks of unspoken tension, of quiet observation, of a connection that had been building in the silence between us. It tasted of coffee and rain and a longing so profound it ached. He pulled back slightly, just enough to rest his forehead against mine. His eyes were closed, his breathing a little uneven. His hand was still on my face, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw, grounding me. "I've wanted to do that since the first day," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "When you stood there, looking so lost, and I had to hook my thumb in your belt just to keep my hands from doing this." The confession shattered the last of my defenses. He had felt it too, from the very beginning. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining things. This was real. A laugh escaped me, a sound halfway between a sob and a sigh of pure, unadulterated relief. "I thought I was going to have a heart attack," I admitted, my voice shaking. He chuckled, a low, warm sound that vibrated through his chest and into mine. He opened his eyes, and his gaze was so full of warmth and something that looked terrifyingly like affection that it stole my breath all over again. "Me too," he said. And then he kissed me again, and this time there was no hesitation, no question. It was a kiss of arrival, a kiss that felt, after a lifetime of waiting, like coming home. I woke to the unfamiliar feeling of warmth at my back. For a disoriented moment, I thought I was dreaming. Then the memories of the night before came rushing back in a dizzying, heart-stopping flood. The storm, the candlelight, Cole's confession, his lips on mine. I slowly opened my eyes. The morning light was filtering through the window, soft and gray. The storm had passed. Cole was asleep behind me, his arm draped possessively over my waist, his body spooned against mine. His breathing was a deep, even rhythm against my neck. He smelled of sleep and skin and something that was just fundamentally him. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the warm haze of contentment. What now? What happens when the sun is up and the magic of the storm has faded? Regret was a bitter, familiar taste in my mouth. I was certain I would find it in his eyes when he woke up. This was a mistake, a moment of storm-induced madness. He was a kind man, and I was a lonely one, and he had probably just felt sorry for me. The old, insidious voice of my self-doubt began its relentless whisper campaign in my head. Carefully, so as not to wake him, I slipped out from under his arm and out of the bed. The floorboards creaked under my feet, and I froze, looking back at him. He stirred, murmuring something in his sleep, but didn't wake. I escaped the room like a thief, my heart pounding a guilty rhythm against my ribs. Downstairs, the house was quiet and still. The power was back on. The digital clock on the stove glowed a cheerful green. The world was back to normal. And in the normal, bright light of day, what had happened between us felt like a fragile, impossible dream. I moved to the kitchen and started making coffee, the familiar ritual a flimsy anchor in a sea of uncertainty. I measured the grounds, filled the carafe, and pressed the button, focusing on the small, mechanical tasks, trying to outrun my own thoughts. I heard the floorboards creak upstairs, followed by the sound of footsteps. My stomach twisted into a tight, anxious knot. He was awake. This was it. The moment of truth. The awkward conversation, the polite retreat, The inevitable return to the silence I knew so well. I braced myself, my back to the doorway, staring intently at the coffee maker as if it held the secrets to the universe. He appeared in the doorway, and I could feel his presence before I saw him. I risked a glance. He was leaning against the doorframe, wearing just his jeans from the day before, his chest bare. His hair was messy from sleep, and his face was still soft with it. He wasn't looking at me with regret or pity. He was just watching me, his expression quiet and thoughtful. "Morning," he said. His voice was husky with sleep, a low, intimate sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "Morning." I managed my voice tight. I turned back to the coffee maker, busying myself with getting a mug from the cabinet. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions. I could feel his eyes on me, and the weight of his gaze was unbearable. "Just say it," I thought. "Just tell me it was a mistake so we can get this over with." He pushed off the doorframe and walked into the kitchen. He didn't stop a polite distance away. He came right up behind me, so close I could feel the heat of his body. My entire back tingled with awareness. I stood frozen, my hand clutching the coffee mug. He didn't speak. Instead, he reached around me, his hands settling on the counter on either side of my hips, effectively trapping me in the cage of his arms. He leaned in, his chin brushing the top of my shoulder, his lips close to my ear. My breath hitched. "I woke up," he whispered, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through me. "And for a second, I didn't know where I was. And then I realized I was next to you, and I felt." He paused, and I held my breath, waiting for the blow. "Safe." The word hung in the air between us, simple and profound. Not regretful, not confused. Safe. He pressed a soft, lingering kiss to the side of my neck, just below my ear. The gesture was so tender, so full of a quiet certainty, that it unraveled the knot of anxiety in my chest completely. All the fear, all the doubt, just evaporated. I leaned my head back against his shoulder, my eyes closing. A shaky breath escaped me. "I thought you'd be gone," I admitted, my voice thick with emotion. His arms wrapped around my waist from behind, pulling me back against his solid chest. He rested his chin on my shoulder. "Not a chance," he murmured into my hair. "Took me long enough to get here. I'm not in a hurry to leave." We stood like that for a long time, wrapped in the quiet intimacy of the morning, the scent of coffee filling the air around us. The silence was no longer heavy or lonely. It was comfortable, peaceful. It was the silence of two people who had finally found a place to rest. The coffee maker beeped, signaling it was done, and the sound was a gentle intrusion, a reminder that the day was beginning. Our day? The first one. The work on the door was finished. Cole installed the new hardware, a handsome set of brushed bronze handles that felt cool and solid under my hand. He tested the lock, opened and closed the doors a dozen times, his focus as intense as it had been on the first day. But now, everything was different. When he'd reach for a tool, his hand would deliberately brush mine. When he knelt to adjust a hinge, he'd glance up at me and a slow smile would spread across his face. The subtext had become the text. The final task was cleaning up. We worked together, sweeping up sawdust, folding the drop cloths. The easy, domestic rhythm felt both completely new and strangely familiar, as if we'd been doing this for years. When the last of his tools were packed in his bag and the living room was clean, a new kind of tension entered the room. The job was done. The reason for him being here was officially over. He stood by the new doors, his tool bag in his hand. He looked from the doors to me, a question in his hazel eyes. This was the precipice. The moment where this fragile, new thing between us could either move forward or end with a polite handshake and a check for services rendered. My heart, which had felt so light all morning, began to feel heavy again. "Well," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "That's that. Good as new." "It's perfect, Cole," I said, and I meant it. "Thank you. Let me write you a check." The words tasted like ash in my mouth. It felt like a dismissal, a reduction of everything that had happened between us back to a simple transaction. He watched me as I walked to my desk and pulled out my checkbook. My hands were shaking as I wrote his name, the date, the amount we had agreed upon. I tore it out and walked back to him, holding it out. He didn't take it. He just looked at the check in my hand, then back up at my face. He set his tool bag down with a soft thud. "The door's fixed," he said, his voice low and serious. He took a step closer to me, closing the space between us. But I have a feeling there are other things around here that might need my attention. He reached out and took the check from my fingers, folding it once and sliding it into his back pocket without looking at it. Then his hand came up and cupped my cheek, his thumb stroking softly, just as it had the night before. "I'm not talking about work, Leo," he clarified, his gaze intense and unwavering. Relief washed over me in a wave so powerful it made my knees weak. "Good," I breathed, because I was thinking the kitchen faucet has been dripping. A real, genuine laugh burst out of him, a rich, warm sound that filled the entire room. The last of the tension dissolved, replaced by a giddy, hopeful joy. "Is that so?" he said, his eyes sparkling with amusement. He leaned in, his lips brushing mine. "I'll have to take a look at it. Might be an all-day job." "Might be," I agreed, my voice a whisper against his mouth. "Could take weeks. Months," he countered, and then he was kissing me, a deep, thorough kiss that was full of promise, a kiss that tasted like the beginning of everything. The days that followed were a quiet revelation. Cole didn't move in, not officially, but he was there more than he was at his own small apartment in town. He'd show up in the evenings after his jobs, his truck crunching on the gravel, a welcome, familiar sound. He'd bring groceries, or a pizza, or just himself. We'd eat on the patio, watching the fireflies begin their nightly dance in the twilight. We talked for hours, filling in the empty spaces of each other's lives, sharing stories of childhoods, of past heartaches, of quiet dreams. I learned that he loved old movies, that he was a surprisingly good cook, and that he had a quiet, dry wit that often caught me by surprise. He, in turn, learned about the intricate worlds I created in my illustrations. He'd sit in my studio for hours, just watching me work, a quiet, solid presence that I found incredibly grounding. He never made me feel self-conscious. Instead, he made me feel seen, his appreciation for my art as real and solid as the things he built with his own hands. He fixed the dripping faucet. He repaired a loose step on the porch. He mowed the overgrown lawn. He slowly, methodically, began to fix all the broken things around the house, and with each small act of care, he was mending the broken pieces of me, too. One evening, we were sitting on the porch swing he'd repaired, gently moving back and forth in the warm air. A comfortable silence had settled between us, our shoulders brushing, his hand resting on my knee. "You know," I said, looking out at the stars that were beginning to prick the dark velvet of the sky. "Before you came, the silence in this house was so loud. It was deafening." He didn't say anything, just tightened his hand on my knee, a silent encouragement to continue. "Now," I continued, turning to look at him, at his strong profile silhouetted against the fading light. "It's just quiet. It's peaceful." He turned his head, and his hazel eyes were soft in the twilight. "That's because you're not listening to it alone anymore," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. He was right. The house was still quiet, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with the quiet hum of a shared life, with the unspoken understanding that passed between us in a single glance, with the comfortable weight of his presence next to me. A few weeks later, I woke up one morning to find him already gone. A flicker of the old panic returned, but it was quickly extinguished. This was different. We had a rhythm, a trust. I went downstairs and found a note on the kitchen counter, written in his strong, blocky handwriting on a torn piece of paper towel. "Had an early job. Back this afternoon. Don't miss me too much." Underneath the words, he'd drawn a clumsy, lopsided smiley face. I smiled, tracing the silly drawing with my finger. I spent the day working, feeling a sense of peace and focus I hadn't experienced in years. My illustrations were better, more vibrant, more full of life. It was as if the color had been turned up in my own world, and it was spilling onto the page. When his truck pulled in late that afternoon, I met him at the door. He looked tired, his shirt smudged with dirt, but his face lit up when he saw me. He dropped his tool bag on the porch and pulled me into his arms, kissing me deeply, a hungry, possessive kiss that left me breathless. "Long day?" I asked, when he finally let me go. "The longest," he said, his hands resting on my hips. "I have something for you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single, shiny key. He pressed it into my palm. It was a key to his truck. I stared at it, speechless. "Cole, I know you don't go into town much," he said, his expression serious. but I want you to know you can. Anytime. If you need something. If you just want to get out. If you need to come find me." He paused, his thumb rubbing small circles on the back of my hand. "And I want to have a key to this place. Not because I feel like I need to be able to barge in, but because I want to know I have a place to come home to." My throat was thick with emotion. A place to come home to. He was offering me everything I'd ever wanted without even knowing it. Security. Trust. A future. "Yes," I said, my voice hoarse. "Of course. Yes." That night, we lay in bed, the windows open to the cool night air and the sound of crickets. We weren't touching, just lying side by side, our hands linked in the space between us. I thought back to the man I was just a month ago, the lonely illustrator rattling around in a silent house, a man who thought a broken door was the biggest of his problems. I had been living in black and white, and Cole had walked into my life and painted it in full, vibrant color. He had fixed my door, but in doing so, he had opened a new one, a door I never knew existed. A door to a life that wasn't silent, that wasn't lonely. A life filled with the scent of sawdust and pine, the sound of a low, rumbling laugh, and the steady, comforting weight of his hand in mine. I squeezed his hand, and he squeezed back, a silent conversation in the dark. I didn't need to say the words. He already knew. He had known from the very beginning. I turned my head on the pillow and looked at him. In the faint moonlight, I could just make out the steady rise and fall of his chest. He was here. He was real. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt like I was, too. I was no longer an observer of my own life. I was in it, living it, sharing it. I was finally, truly home.